you need for this summit and lots of other resources. So that is the bit.ly front slash TLF Summit. All your summit needs will be there each session. So that is going for the whole year. You can continue to use that. That said, once you go to that hub page, you're going to find our YouTube channel. There's a link, and sessions are recorded and they are uploaded onto that YouTube channel. So we encourage you, if you'd like, if you want to rewatch something, if you'd like to take it back to your staff and show it, that's fine. In fact, we love that. And if it's a starting point for some deeper conversations you'd like to have us plan for you, please reach out. That's why we're here. Okay, for our elementary folks, we had some questions around the SBPR, asking about training. Our leadership has advised us that CNI does not support the SBPR. That is an OAR function. So if you'll direct your questions to that, to Melissa Ariano. All right, now for the gift part. You have books at your location. It's the Coaching for Equity book by Elena Aguilar. Elena has some really deep and thoughtful information in this book, and we just thought getting it into the hands of the TLF is going to help you guys, maybe hone some coaching skills. So those are at your school sites. If you have it, great. If you have not picked it up yet, please make arrangements to do that. Every TLF gets one. So just make sure you have that, and if you don't, please let us know. Along with that, on that bit.ly site, there is a Google form that we would like you to fill out. We would like to do book clubs with the Coaching for Equity. Now, these are voluntary, and there are a couple of ways you could do these. We will have a CNI staff member develop or work with you on a book club if you'd like to do that, but you could also self-organize and do one if you're a high school. I know you have lots of TLFs, so you could organize one at your high school site, or again, work with a member of our team. And that's what the questionnaire on the Google form is for. So please fill it out whether you'd like to participate or not, just so we have an idea of who's interested. In our spring summit, we will have additional time for processing that Coaching for Equity book. So even if you're not in a book club, we'll set aside some time to process that. We will also have the equity sessions. So this is a leadership anchor. We also have an equity anchor at each of our summits. And for equity, in February, their focus will be attending to emotions. In March, it will be the elephant in the room. And in April, it is your legacy. So does anybody have any questions about any of those announcements right now? Okay, next slide.
This brings us to the little red toolbox. Some of you may have seen this, but we wanted to just kind of let you guys know it is here. This is a document that really is just a resource of all the different things we have out there. It is not curriculum, so just giving you guys a heads up. It's more about professional learning or technological things. So if you ever have a chance, it is on our main page of the CNI website, the Hub. So if you have a chance, go in there and just look through it. It has stuff that ranges from the TLF MOU all the way to you guys. It has guidance for EL learners. All the departments have added some to this. So please take a chance to look at it, as well as if you look at it and see, hey, what I really need is not on there. Go ahead at the very bottom of where the toolbox says toolbox, there's a, look here for questions. Just click on that. It's a Google form, and you can just say, hey, I really need this. So make sure to fill that out if what you need is not on there. But take a chance and look at it.
All right, and as you can see, this is kind of this information. Now, to keep in mind, you will get this slide deck. Heather, our tech will pop it into the chat, so you will have it during this session. It will be a PDF version, but those links will work. So you can see on there, we have that link to the hub. Also, our elementary and secondary newsletters are on there. All right, next slide. Okay, since you are here for our leadership and wellness session, if we have done the leadership anchor earlier this year twice. This is our third session. And so our first one was based on 10 traits of effective leaders. And we looked at the importance of building community. And then our second session, we looked at a short little video clip called Lollipop Moments. And it talked about empowering others and developing leaders in those moments that you see at your school. This time, we're going to skip down to number 8. And that effective leadership, that's tagged in the PowerPoint slide. So if you don't have that, you'll have a copy of that. We're skipping to 8 this time, and it is leading by example. So we've all heard that saying, do as I do as I say, sorry, not as I do. I know I said it to my kids. And of course, that's a very ironic statement because our actions always speak louder than our words. And the strongest leaders are those that show that by action. So today, with our leadership and wellness anchor, we would like you to take a moment to work on your wellness so that you can take that back to the school. There is a man, an amazing man. His name is Albert Schweitzer, and he's a philosopher and a physician. And he has the quote that you see on there. But Schweitzer was not just any normal person, although he's the gold standard. But he, just researching him a little bit, he actually became a philosopher, got his PhD, and he was a musician his entire life. He was an organist. So he studied music and decided he wanted to go to medical school. So he used his organist fees to pay for medical school. And then he went to the French-speaking part of Africa and began to build hospitals and worked as a surgeon. On top of that, he wrote scholarly books. He's a contemporary historian. And as I said, he is a musician. And just a small note, he also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. So obviously, when he says example is not the main thing, he led by example. So we would love to encourage you to practice your wellness and take that back to school and show teachers that it's okay to take some time for themselves. And as you'll hear today, to set some boundaries. Okay, next slide, Molly. This is one of my favorite quotes because we've all seen it probably, but we need to keep reminding ourselves that we can make change ourselves and that we have power. So change can happen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful behavior support specialists, Anna Kay and Molly Keys, as they guide us through this session on wellness and boundaries. Please enjoy.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you, everyone. I just want to start by extending such a deep bow of gratitude to you all, TLFs. Thank you for your dedication to your school sites, your students, the teachers that you support, and our APS learning community as a whole. I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, my brilliant colleague, Molly Keys today. We'll be co-facilitating, and both of us realize it is no small feat for you to take an hour out of your day, so thank you for making that space for us. We're also joined by the rest of the wonderful leadership team, Mary Kraft, Liz Torres, Jen Sears, Tammy Gaudette, Courtney Grant, and Heather Summers, who is valiantly running tech support for us today. So We're a relatively large group, but we want to make sure that you have space to ask questions and share your ideas. So we have kind of two avenues for that today. You can put your thoughts into the chat, and one of our leadership team can respond to that in the moment. We'll also save some space at the end for a little Q&A time. So during that time, we can unmute and just kind of have a rich discussion together. And I know that Heather already dropped the PDF version of this slide deck into the chat. This is yours to use. You can share this with your staff. You can use it as inspiration and recreate it, or just as a resource to reflect on as you need. So you have here sort of our roadmap for today. If you came to our previous teacher wellness session at the last summit, you may see some familiar content today, but the majority of this session will be new content. If you did not attend the first teacher wellness PD, no worries. It was absolutely not a prerequisite of any sorts. We're just glad you're here, and we're excited to move forward with our teacher wellness journey. Our objective today is to focus on teacher wellness, specifically boundaries and boundary setting. And our aim is to give you some practical tools that you can use to promote your own mental and emotional health, and or share these resources with your staff. So we know, obviously, there is so much going on in the world around us, right? In our local community, and also sort of the greater community of our country. And these last couple days have really just had a certain weight to them. I just want to acknowledge that weight and bring voice to it, and acknowledge all of the different emotions that many of us are feeling and bringing with us into this space, and also into the spaces where we teach. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite you to participate in a quick mindfulness activity with us. I know that I need this right now to help me focus on the present moment, so my hope is that it might be of benefit to you all as well. Mindfulness in the virtual setting, I know that sometimes it can feel weird to have your camera on, so if it feels more comfortable to turn your camera off for this, you're welcome to. It's completely up to you. So I'm going to invite you to find a comfortable position to sit, and just take a moment to really notice how your body feels against your chair. And with that awareness on our chair, just beginning to take some really deep, slow, intentional breaths. Noticing now how those breaths feel for you. And as we continue to take really deep breaths, we're going to bring our attention down to the soles of our feet, planted firmly on the ground. If they're crossed, we might uncross them so that we can feel our soles of our feet against the floor. And on the next inhalation, I invite you to take an internal weather report. And just visualize your emotions or your state of mind as if it were a weather pattern. Taking some time to name that weather pattern that you're feeling right now, and just sit with it and experience it without judgment. Some of us may feel like we're in an uncomfortable storm, or maybe just a really pleasant sunny day. And as we breathe, we just want to take a moment to acknowledge that these emotions that we're feeling, this weather pattern we're experiencing, this is part of being human. And if we do find ourselves in an uncomfortable weather pattern, we know that just as weather changes, the state that we are in, it will change. If we're experiencing a storm, we know that it won't last forever. The storm will pass. And as we take a few more deep, intentional breaths, maybe we start to visualize a parting in the clouds, or just notice some of that, the warmth of the sun on our skin. We'll take 2 more deep breaths. May these be the biggest breaths we take today. As you're ready, let's bring our attention back to the soles of our feet against the ground, maybe wiggling our toes. Starting to blink open our eyes as we're ready and bringing our attention back to the space that we're in and the TLF Summit. And if it feels comfortable for you to turn your camera back on, you're welcome to, but if you're not ready, that's fine too. It's up to you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this space. I hope that was helpful. It's a nice way to start the day so early in the morning. And I particularly like this mindfulness activity to share with other teachers because this is a great one, this internal weather report. This is a really good strategy, visualization strategy to use with adults, but this also works well for our learners, right? Kindergartners could do this, 12th graders could do this, and this might be a tool that you might consider using with your students at their school. At your school and their school. Let's see. Oh, I apologize. My notes kind of got stuck. So we know that there's an expansive body of research that supports mindfulness as a tool to promote teacher resiliency, efficacy, emotional stamina, and just really overall health and well-being. If you're interested in exploring more mindfulness resources, you might be interested in the Be Kind to Your Mind booklet that Molly and I created. It's linked to this slide. So you have the PDF of this slide deck and you can access it there. The link sort of under the pencil is the editable version, so you can type right into that document. The link under the little book there is kind of a more printer-friendly version. We're not going to go into too much discussion about mindfulness today, but that Be Kind to Your Mind booklet does have a lot of explanations of why mindfulness is important, and also mindfulness task cards that you can use in your own wellness journey, but also could be something that you share with colleagues or even students. So that's yours to explore. So I obviously don't need to tell you that this is an incredibly stressful time to be a teacher. And that's why we're here today. That's why our focus is leaning towards wellness, specifically leading by example, right? Taking on your own teacher wellness so that you can in turn support the other teachers at your school site. Of course, you are all really well versed in the challenges and realities of distance learning. So I'll be kind of brief here, but we know that many teachers are overwhelmed right now. They're overwhelmed with constant tech issues, barrages of texts and emails and phone calls throughout the day, longer work hours, right? And also just kind of like relearning how to be a strong teacher in this new environment. In reality, so many of us are really feeling like first-year teachers all over again. And these levels of persistent and pervasive stress are leading to increased signs of depression and anxiety and burnout. And on top of all that stress and exhaustion, many of us are also experiencing grief, right? We're grieving the loss of interactions with students. Perhaps we're grieving levels of competency and confidence that we maybe aren't feeling right now. And we're really just grieving the way our life used to be. These emotions are real and they are heavy and in many cases persistent. And the reality for most of us, oh, Molly, do you mind going to the next slide? Thanks, ma'am. The reality for most of us is that we're not working from home. We're not just working from home. We are living at work. And for so many teachers, this does not feel sustainable. And the reality is it's not sustainable. But there's some things we can do, right? There's some proactive ways that we can offset this stress. And when we're using the word stress today, so we're going to be using teacher stress and talking about the relationship in between the teacher's coping resources and the demands of a specific environment and stimuli. So Lazarus and Folkman, in their body of research around like transactional theory and emotions and coping, they explain that we experience stress where perceived demands exceed our personal coping resources and skills. So if we view stress in this way, that means stress is dynamic. As we develop more coping skills, we can in turn offset the imbalance between the demands of our life and our ability to cope with those demands or that stress. So of course, that doesn't mean that stress like will go away, of course, but it does provide some hope that we have some agency in developing skills to manage our own personal levels of stress. So I like to use sort of the metaphor of hiking a mountain, right? All of us face mountains to climb every day, and these mountains are symbolic of the challenges or stressors in our lives. So if I show up to complete a full day hike with like only flip-flops on, that hike is going to be torturous, right? I mean, I still might complete it, but it's going to be a pretty awful experience. But if I show up for that climb with practical gear, right, with appropriate clothing and food and water and footwear, the climb is still probably going to be quite challenging, but I'm better equipped to complete it successfully, right? It might not be so torturous, so horrific. So we can view stress demands of virtual teaching as one of our mountains that we climb, and teacher wellness tools as some of the resources that we need to be able to climb this mountain successfully. So two of those tools, those pieces of equipment that we can take with us on our climb, are considering where we have control and influence, and also setting healthy boundaries. So we're going to start by kind of looking at that control and influence. We went over this in the teacher wellness session at the last summit. I won't go into quite as much detail, but again, in that Be Kind to Your Mind booklet, there's more information on the spheres of control scale. So just briefly, this spheres of control or circles of control is a multidimensional measure of locus of control. Locus being the beliefs about what we can control, either internally or externally. And this visual can help us to identify specific factors in our life that we have direct control over, right? That's that center circle. Factors that we can influence, and factors that impact us but are really outside of our area of control or influence. So I worked with a teacher who was, like many of us, just feeling really overwhelmed by tech issues and just all the stresses of virtual teaching. And so we sat down and we filled out this spheres of control scale together, right? And while we were doing this, she was able to identify in that middle circle the areas where she had absolute control, right? She could control her response to frustration. She could control how and when she asked for help. She could control what she prioritized, right? She recognized she needed to prioritize her sleep and things that she enjoyed, like exercising. And then we looked at her areas of influence, and then all that other stuff that impacted her teaching, right? These were real concerns, but they were outside of her control and outside of her influence. So how is this helpful, this scale? Again, in that Be Kind to Your Mind booklet, we have some of these that you can fill out, or you could just draw 3 circles if you were going to fill this out on your own. But this is helpful because if we complete this activity and if we organize the stressors in our lives by these 3 in these 3 areas, this can help us to identify where maybe a false sense of control can be relinquished, right? So you'll notice in that outside circle, this teacher was being kept awake at night because she was so worried about seesaw glitches or Google Classroom glitches. And those are real concerns because it impacted her teaching and it impacted the learning of her students. But it was so outside of her control that when she put that on this scale, when she woke up at night and started worrying about Google Classroom, she was able to tell herself, wait a second, that's something outside of my control or influence. That's something that I can let go of. Also, if we're using this, it can help us to identify the areas within our control, which can help us create an inventory of how we spend our energy, our mental and emotional energy. So that can help us with goal setting and time management and use of influence. And all of this together really promotes a strong sense or stronger sense of teacher resiliency. So now we're going, even though the spheres of control scale is not here, let's kind of in our mind's eye direct our attention back to that center circle on the spheres of control scale and think about the things that we really can control. So we can control the choices that we make. We can control our responses to stress. We can control how we prioritize our time or our values. And we can also control the boundaries that we set. Now, just because we can control these things, I'm not saying that it's easy, right? Like for me, for example, I often have a really hard time controlling my response to stress. So that's something I'm still working on. It is within my control, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily something easy. I don't want to paint that picture. So this is a short list and sort of a generalized list of elements that are within our control. And I'm going to invite us to just take a moment of reflection. You have two options for this. I'm going to give you a prompt, and you can either just kind of jot down your reflection on a piece of paper or sit with that reflection quietly, or you're welcome to put your responses in the chat so we can kind of start a collaborative conversation here. So I would like you to take a moment and just think, what are the things that are absolutely in your control right now? As a human being, but also as a teacher in the virtual setting, what really is within your control? I'll give us a couple minutes to reflect. Again, you're welcome to use the chat or just jot this down to yourself. I see how I choose to show up every day. Yeah, and preparing lessons and assignments, my reactions, how I respond to people. Sleeping, yeah, how we prioritize our sleep, that's a big one. My face and my attitude that I present. Staying confident and positive. Email responses, my time. Ooh, consistent communication skills, that's a good one. My well-being and how I present myself to my students. Absolutely. When I stop and start each day. Super, thank you. You can continue to put those into the chat as you feel comfortable. But you're right, like when I look at this list, I think, man, it's a relatively short list, right? But it's an important list. These are all really important skill sets to focus on. So now we're going to kind of hone in on that fourth bullet point on this slide, which is boundaries. So boundaries are our guidelines or limits that guide our responses to others or our response to our environment. So boundaries can serve as a tool to help us protect and prioritize our values. Boundaries may be rigid or porous, depending on context. Boundaries can also be flexible, and they may change as our circumstances or our own personal needs change. So I think the word boundary in and of itself can be a little bit misleading. I think sometimes it conveys this idea of keeping oneself separate, right? Like this idea that if I have strong boundaries, I'm detached or I am separate from others. But boundaries are actually, we can think of them as connecting points, right? They're how and when and in what format we connect with our world around us. Boundaries are connecting points since they provide healthy rules for navigating relationships, relationships with other people or relationships with our own environment. So when I think of the boundaries, for example, that I have with the time I spend working each day, I think of where my connecting points are to my work in terms of how I connect with that work and how I connect with the people that I work with. It's kind of two sides of the same coin, but sometimes I think, I don't know, maybe a little more positive way to frame boundaries. So there are a variety of types of boundaries. We may think of kind of like the most basic and obvious type of boundary being physical boundaries, right? Which includes safety, physical safety, and whether we feel comfortable being touched or being hugged. Right? This has like a whole new meaning now with social distancing. That sort of personal boundary takes on a whole new definition. But in looking at this list, these areas where boundaries may lie, I want to kind of pull our attention over to the one in the top right-hand corner, protective of time. So in my own experience as a classroom teacher and my experience in working with teachers, I find that this area of boundary, this boundary that protects our time and how we allocate our time, this tends to be an area that for so many of us teachers, this one is really hard, right? By nature and by the growing expectations of the profession, this one can be hard to protect, in my opinion. So I won't go through and read all of these, but I want to give you a minute with this slide and just take some time to read through these. And then I'm going to ask you to take just another moment of personal reflection and ask yourself, which of these boundaries, these boundary areas are most important to you as an individual? And which of these boundary areas would you like to work on? And by work on, I mean maybe either making those boundaries more rigid or maybe making those boundaries more porous. And you can put this in the chat if you want, but I think this question is really just designed for personal reflection. So I'll give you about 60 seconds to just to sit with that. Which boundary area is most important and which one would you like to work on? Tony, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that is that's something a lot of us are working on. And here in a minute, when Molly takes over, she's going to actually share a resource that might be helpful in that part of your reflection. So if you're still reflecting, continue. We're going to move on to the next slide. So let's quickly talk about boundaries, or that's what we have been talking about. Sorry, barriers, barriers for boundary setting for teachers, right? There are some obvious barriers for teachers and human beings, right? When it comes to setting boundaries, natural barriers, barriers that are by no means our fault, but they're just kind of a part of our reality. So first and foremost, for many of us, guilt can be a barrier to setting up boundaries, right? by nature, us as teachers, we are givers. We give of ourselves in so many ways to the nth degree, and we may experience guilt if we're not giving every ounce of ourselves to our students, our families, and our profession, even if and when we know that this is really not sustainable. That second bullet point, the like Pinterest teacher perception, right? There's often this concept of that like perfect Pinterest teacher that many of us see on social media. These like really pristine classrooms and activities in the virtual setting where like everything's going perfectly. We all know that what we see online is not necessarily reality, right? People usually only share the good stuff, like the bright, shiny stuff. They don't typically share the lessons that kind of crashed and burned. But even if we know this deep down, many of us are so inundated with these types of teacher posts, and that can really start to impact our emotional boundaries as well as our boundaries around time. That might just be a barrier we need to be cognizant of. That third bullet point, like this was not on the syllabus, right? Like I don't know about everybody else, but I certainly did not learn anything about setting boundaries in my undergrad education, or we didn't talk about this in grad school. I had really great mentor teachers along the way, but this just like really didn't come up, right? This isn't kind of part of our typical lexicon, our teacher conversation. And that's a barrier, right? It can be kind of hard to be that first person that starts to bring this up in our learning community. And finally, like our current work environment, the nature of online teaching, and that so many of us are now living at work, this presents a barrier to creating boundaries. But we still know that even though there are barriers, boundaries are really helpful. They help us to prioritize our own well-being, our own physical, mental, and emotional needs. They help us to prevent burnout, right? They're an important tool for balancing that work and home environment, right? Which is all the more important since we're all now living at work and working from home. And they help us to conserve our energy, right? They help us to decide how we allocate our mental, emotional, and social energy. So what do healthy boundaries look like? I'm just going to touch on this briefly. Molly's going to go into more detail. But ideally, healthy boundaries are layered with self-compassion, right? Boundaries can be really, really hard to create and maintain. And as we're building these, we just want to provide a lot of space to show ourselves some self-compassion, right? Some pre-forgiveness that we'll make mistakes along the way, and that's okay, right? That's part of the process. Boundaries also should align with our values, right? Healthy boundaries help us to kind of point us in the direction of our personal values. And they can also be, or they should be firm while also being flexible, right? Boundaries are most successful when we have a really firm understanding of our own limits or our own connecting points and communicate those limits and connecting points to others. However, we know that boundaries can be flexible depending on context or in response to the ways that our personal priorities or needs may shift. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Molly, and she's going to take us from here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anna. So this specific statement is one that is almost like a mantra for me in terms of my own practice with setting boundaries, because it's important to remind yourself that setting boundaries really, it is not a selfish act. It is an act of self-preservation. This is you taking care of yourself, because if you can't take care of yourself, then you can't take care of others. So this is an important statement to remember and keep in mind as you're moving forward with your own practice and setting boundaries, because it helps to keep that in your head as an important idea in general. There will be challenges to your boundary setting practice, and when those come up, just remind yourself, this is not me being selfish. This is me protecting myself. And that is a vital thing to remember. So I do want to take a moment and kind of reiterate what Anna said about how there's boundaries. I mean, there are boundaries. You can tell it's early. There are barriers to boundary setting. And so this is part of why boundary setting really is hard, specifically for teachers. We are individuals who put others' needs first every time. If it comes down to me eating my lunch or a student eating a lunch, I'm going to give my lunch to a student because that's just what I do. That's what teachers do. We also have a lot of fear around the idea of setting boundaries because we worry that it might jeopardize our job or how others perceive our performance in our job. And being in such a public profession where, well, we're online now, but our principal can pop in at any moment, or another teacher can join our meet and see what's going on. Or when we're in person, someone walking down the hallway can see everything about what we're doing. And if they see that after school we leave a little bit earlier than we normally do, or we get to school right when our duty day starts instead of 3 hours before, there's some judgment that gets passed, and we fear that a great deal. So it's important to recognize that, and in recognizing it, use it to help you fortify those boundaries. It's also difficult because we haven't done this before. It hasn't been taught to us intentionally. Many of us didn't learn this until our adulthood. I know I didn't learn it until my therapist yelled at me. And so it's really vital that we recognize that and we honor that. And then there's the idea that we as teachers may not have a clear conception about who we are outside of our profession. Teaching essentially becomes this all-encompassing identity. Whereas other jobs like an accountant, I'm not going to leave my office as an accountant, go out into the world and still wear my accountant hat. But meanwhile, as a teacher, I'm going to leave my classroom carrying bags upon bags of things I need to do, planning I need to perform, stuff I need to grade. And I'm going to carry that with me. And then I'm going to go to Walmart and see something cool that I could use to teach this lesson on blah, and I'm going to buy it because I'm still wearing my teacher hat. It's something that carries through. So when you don't have a firm identity of who you are outside of the profession, it can make it hard to set limits. And then, of course, sometimes we don't feel as though we have the right to set boundaries. Because we're in a public service profession, because we serve others and we are trying our best to do what's best for our communities, we oftentimes take the back seat and feel as though we don't have the privilege of setting boundaries. But the truth is we do. And the truth is that it's vital if we want to continue to serve our students and our communities. So first, when you're going into the practice of setting boundaries, you need to start by assessing where your boundaries currently are. So asking yourself that question, how do I know where my barriers are? And we're going to go into some questions and some ideas of how you can start assessing that. We're going to be performing some reflection, thinking about how do I know when I need to create boundaries? You're in this practice, you're going to think about your limits. How do I know my limits? Where are they? Where do they begin and end? And are these limits something that's flexible or firm? And then in communication, this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of setting boundaries, because I can set boundaries all day long, but eventually I'm going to need to communicate those to others in order to defend those boundaries. And in many ways, that's the most difficult part, because suddenly you're fearful of conflict, you're afraid of the judgment that others might pass against you, and all kinds of things. So it's really important that we plan and consider how that communication will look. So right now, what we're going to go into is that practice of what setting boundaries looks like and defining those limits, and then head into defending those boundaries. So in creating this presentation, Anna and I did a lot of research. I think the folder that we're working in has about 20 or 30 different research articles and blogs and posts and worksheets and information from counselors and therapists. There's a whole lot in there. And generally, therapists seem to agree that there's essentially 5 steps to setting boundaries, separated into 2 sections. So first, there's the self-awareness section, where you identify the symptoms of boundaries being crossed. You identify irrational or unhealthy behaviors that feed into the feelings you have when those boundaries are crossed. Then you can replace those unhealthy behaviors and ideas with newer, healthier practices that can firm up your identity and protect you. And then we have our action behaviors. Action behaviors are where you're actually going into the practice of setting those boundaries and implementing them in your daily life. So let's start with self-awareness. In the practice of self-awareness, this is where you are stopping and getting back into touch with you. You are paying attention to yourself, your feelings, your physical responses to situations, and your emotions. And you're considering those in specific situations. So in this practice, you might reflect on specific situations where you feel low energy. Maybe you have that physical urge to cry, or you suddenly feel overwhelmed and you're not sure why. These can all be symptomatic responses to situations in which you are in need of setting boundaries. So for example, a coworker that I used to work closely with would have the response of feeling the urge to cry anytime she needed to go into her administrator's office. It didn't matter if it was a positive meeting, a negative meeting, or anything like that. And in fact, she had a good relationship with our administrator. But yet every single time she went in there, that urge to cry just bubbled up. This signaled to her eventually that she really needed to set a boundary and say, I'm not going into a meeting with this principal alone, or any principal in the future. I'm always going to have someone with me. And that was a personal boundary to protect her own emotional state and her physical state. She's still not sure why she had that urge to cry, but setting that boundary helped to make her feel safer and more able to discuss whatever needed to be talked about with the principal. So then once you have settled into that practice of recognizing your emotions and physiological responses to various situations, then you can go into the step of really analyzing that a little bit. So for example, in this case, we're working on recognizing mental habits. We all have specific mental habits that sometimes can be quite negative. These tend to be unhealthy beliefs about ourselves and worries that are not based on rationality. These are specifically irrational thoughts. And so, for example, I continue to maintain the irrational thought that I don't deserve new clothes, that I can't go and buy new clothes when I need them. Even if the clothes that I have are threadbare, they don't fit, the washing machine chewed them up, I am going to keep those clothes because I have that internal belief that I don't deserve to go shopping. But that's not true, and that's irrational. The truth is that when I need clothes, I can go and get them. I deserve that. I deserve to feel good in the clothes that I wear. So I'm working intentionally on replacing that unhealthy, irrational belief with something rational and based in truth. So in order to build boundaries, what we need to do is really practice identifying those unhealthy beliefs, recognizing them when they pop up, and replacing them. So you're kind of talking to yourself in this situation. I might say to myself, I don't deserve that, and then stop and tell myself, no, I do. I have a right to have new clothes. So in this example, this is a teacher-specific one, in which the irrational, unhealthy belief is that I should do everything I can to spend as much time as possible preparing to teach, or else my students won't grow and everyone will see me as a failure. I think a lot of us have had that thought. I know I have. And once we recognize that that's a pervasive, unhealthy belief, we can then start to replace it with a healthy boundary building statement that is based on the truth. And the honest to goodness truth is that you have the right, and not just a right, but a need to explore your own interests and desires. And that taking time for yourself and your needs doesn't harm your students, and it does not make you a failure. So that healthy boundary building statement is something that can really help you to define more concretely what you do believe about yourself and states a need that can be acted on. And speaking of action, so we've identified kind of our emotions, we've analyzed those feelings, we've found those unhealthy beliefs and rooted them out. Then we built that and flipped the script into a healthy boundary builder. And now we're heading into those action steps. These action behaviors are how we lead into our boundary statements. So in this case, we are stating our boundary and acting on them. Notice that word action. I'm going to repeat that word a lot, along with the word boundary, of course. But boundary and action are really, they go hand in hand. You can't set a boundary that does not rely upon an action that you can take. And if you're not willing to take an action on that boundary, then it's not a boundary that you can actually use. So in this step, this is where you're clarifying that idea of the boundary with your needs and your values in mind. And this is also, of course, centered around that healthy thinking belief. These are statements that can be said clearly, calmly, firmly, unemotionally, and in as few words as possible. So this is something that if someone is pushing you or trying to make you cross that boundary, you can respond very simply. So in this case, we saw our irrational belief, we saw our healthy boundary builder, and that led to our boundary statement of, I will not work on weekends. Now again, for some of us, that might not be an action that we are willing to take. I know for me, as a classroom teacher, that was never an action that I could take. I felt too much anxiety not doing some work on weekends. So in my case, my boundary statement was that I will not work more than 2 hours on a Sunday. So my Saturdays were free and 2 hours of my Sunday were reserved for working on planning and preparing for the next week. That's it. That was an action that I was willing to take. Now, for some of us, I will not work on weekends is an action that you can take, and I encourage you to do so. So when you're working on these boundary statements, going back to the idea of what therapists kind of agree on, most of the articles and the work from therapists that I read agreed that there's around 5 guidelines for setting healthy boundaries. These include being clear, presenting your boundaries clearly and unemotionally, because when you start wrapping in emotions and when you start over-explaining, then gaps are able to get poked in your boundaries and people are able to force their way in and around. And we don't want that. We want to be able to defend our needs, because our needs being met is what fuels us to be able to help others. As I said already, they're based on actions that you are willing to take. So if you're setting boundaries, think about the action that goes along with that. What are you willing to do in order to meet your needs? Another idea that is important to keep in mind is being gradual. So I'm not going to wake up in the morning with my list of boundaries that's about a mile long and start implementing every single one. That is not reasonable. That is what would drive me insane and end up making kind of the whole thing crumble apart. Instead, what I would do is start with something small, like I will not walk the dog after sunset. That is a boundary for me. And that's something I can implement. If the sun goes down, I just ain't gonna do it. And if someone pushes me on it, I will say, I do not walk the dog after sunset. Done. That's a boundary that I can easily defend. Then there's this idea of reflecting. So in these guidelines, reflection is really valuable, because not only is reflection important for your process of setting boundaries, but it's vital for your process of keeping those boundaries. So going back and thinking, when I told him I wouldn't walk the dog after sunset, this was the response, and this is how I felt emotionally. I wonder why that was. And then also continually going back and reflecting on your boundaries to assess where they are and what you need from them. So maybe that boundary about walking the dog after sunset doesn't need to be super firm. Maybe there are situations where I would feel fine about that, like if someone walked with me or if I had a flashlight. And so that would, maybe those boundaries that were really firm can be more porous, or perhaps those porous boundaries need to be firmed up. Reflection helps you to decide that. And then last, standing strong. Your emotions, your boundaries, and your needs are vitally important. And so holding on to that and being willing to stand by your boundaries is how you protect yourself and how you ensure that you can show up for others, because you have the energy and the means to do so. So here's some situational examples of setting boundaries. These are things that are kind of common pressures that we're faced with, or situations that we're faced with. My favorite one on here is the anger piece, because that's one that when I know I'm someone that is very sensitive to perceiving that someone is angry with me. I crumble and fall apart, and it's like my world is ending. And so I need to set some specific boundaries when I'm faced with aggression. This can mean not only in my personal life, but also with parents in my classroom. I've had to state this boundary. You may not continue to raise your voice to me. If you do, I will need to leave this conversation. Now, if I state that with aggression and anger back, or sadness, then the purpose of the statement doesn't quite get through as well. But instead, if I'm standing firm and saying, I'm going to leave this conversation if you continue, then the point gets across, and I feel more firm in my understanding and my statement of my needs. And notice in this statement, there is not only the boundary, but there is also a consequence here. If you continue to cross this boundary, here's how I will respond. And that's something to consider as well at times, because challenges to your boundary will occur. So figuring out how you will respond in those cases is very important. Just like the BSS team always says in our behavior trainings of, you might want to have responses to those specific behaviors that keep occurring over and over again. Have a little script for yourself. This is similar. Plan for those events in which your boundaries are pushed and figure out how you might respond. So some other situational examples. One of my favorites on here is this lunch one, and of course the communication piece. For example, for lunch, students may have questions during my lunchtime, and I may get emails, but they will not be responded to because I need to eat in peace. I know working from home, I suddenly stopped having a lunch break. I suddenly stopped having any breaks. I just worked straight through the day, every day. And that felt odd once I realized it. So I've been working really hard on setting that boundary and saying, well, they may want to have a meeting at that time, or that email might be really pressing, but I need to have a lunch break because I need time. I need time to actually literally digest. So I'm going to take that. And that means those emails won't get responded to. That means that meeting might get delayed. That's fine, because I need to meet my needs. So here's one that you're going to try out. And what I'd like you to do is you can either, of course, write it down and reflect on it for yourself, or if you feel comfortable, share your response. This is a situation that I think most of us have faced in the past. And the temptation here, of course, is to respond to this person who thinks that teachers are lazy and overpaid and all of this, is to maybe get a little defensive and respond, well, you're welcome to come to my classroom anytime you want and see the truth. Like, or we might be tempted to say something like, you weren't educated and you didn't take 8 years of education to get your bachelor's and master's degree in this. I know what I'm doing. Like, those defensive responses kind of tend to just get more aggression back. Instead, in this situation, what we want to try to do is set a boundary with this person, because this is someone that is in your life, a family member who just regularly makes these statements. You're hurt by this, and you want this person not to cross this boundary again, because challenging them and responding with aggression and arguments will facilitate more boundary crossing. What we want to do in this statement is set a boundary that is firm, clearly stated, and based around your values and needs in this situation. because nobody wants their job to be assaulted by a family member. So what statement can we make to respond to this individual? I'll give you, I don't know, a little bit of time until I feel uncomfortable. Oh, wow. And I'm finally getting a chance to look at the chat. You all are having excellent conversations. Yeah, an I statement is definitely a great form of communication, Amanda. I adore I statements because they help to communicate your feelings and your needs. And make sure that you are also stating in that the boundary that's getting crossed here. I feel that you have a problem with my profession and you continue to make statements that hurt my feelings. If you continue, blah, or I will not listen to blah. So I love I statements. So Anna said, those statements hurt my feelings because I feel like my professional identity is being attacked. I will continue to talk to you about this only if we can keep it calm and kind. Wonderful. And I love, so Anna's boundary there is that the conversation has to remain civil. Once it becomes something that is no longer calm and kind, that means that you're going to stop the conversation. So, and Emily asked a great question. So does this mean we have to cut these people out if they don't comply with our boundaries? Not necessarily. Like in this case, it wouldn't mean cutting that person out. It would mean, I'm not going to talk to you about education anymore. Like I have an uncle, and I had to stop and guess at that because I don't really talk to him much anyway. But I have an uncle who has some very, very specific beliefs about teachers. This example may have come from my life. And I do love my uncle, and I'm going to see him at family reunions and at family gatherings. But I do have a boundary where I do not talk about my job with him. And if he starts talking about it, I tell him, if you continue this conversation, I'm going to walk away. And I've walked away several times. I state that boundary. So awesome. And just continue to reflect on that idea of like, what limit can you set? Because certainly you don't have to cut these people out. It's like there's people that we love and need in our lives, and professionally we can't cut people out professionally because we have to work with each other. So setting these boundaries actually protects you from being from needing to chop those people off. It sets the limits for what that relationship can and should look like. So when we are working through setting boundaries, as I said before, we're going to face several challenges in that process. And taking time to plan for and understand those challenges can help you to prepare to reinforce your boundaries. I kind of think of it like you're setting up a fort. Forts have doors and openings that you can let people through. Those are more porous parts of your boundaries. Then in other parts of the fort, you have these solid walls that cannot be crossed. Well, at some point or another, your fort's going to come under attack. Those, you might maybe open the gates if they're porous and let them in, or you might defend your walls, stand on those walls and prepare for that attack. There isn't a single castle or fort in the world that didn't know an attack was coming at some point or another, so they have defenses built in. So we need to consider what our defenses could look like. So life shifts are one of those challenges that pops up a lot. Changes in life and schedules and work are things that happen. They're going to occur. And when that happens, you may need to redraw those boundary lines. For example, shifting from in-person teaching to teaching at home or online, there's a lot of boundaries that suddenly changed. Where I went from having a designated duty-free lunch time, now I need to work that in myself and figure out where that fits. Redrawing those lines and reforming those boundaries is sometimes very necessary. You'll also face disagreements and misunderstandings. I read in a lot of different therapists' work on boundary setting this statement, which was, I feel, very powerful, which is that when other people have weak boundaries, they may not understand or respect yours. So if someone at their core doesn't really get boundary setting, they give all of themselves to teaching, they give everything they have to everyone else, they have nothing that's theirs. They don't see your boundaries as being a good thing. They're threatened by that. And those people will not agree with your boundary initially. They may push back, they may argue, but clear and open communication can really help to defend that boundary and keep them strong for you. Because remember, those people's lack of boundaries doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries. And then, of course, your own patterns. We all have habits and patterns, and those negative habits and thoughts and beliefs about yourself always have a habit of eking back in. They have a way of sneaking back in all of the time. Like my negative thought pattern around buying clothes. That's something that I'm still working on all of that time. And that irrational thought is still what lives in my brain. So I need to recognize that I have that habit of continuing to go back to that thought and helping myself to recognize that habit and pattern to push me in a better direction. Boundary setting is the same thing. I recognize that I tend to give more of my time than I actually have to teaching and working on my career. So I need to recognize that pattern and eke myself back in the other direction as often as I can. So then we get to that idea of sticking to your boundaries. So remember that you have internal boundaries already. These internal boundaries we can think of as like a filter. This is what kind of takes in the responses of others and helps you to check in to internalize about what you internalize before you take it in and respond. So someone who's attacking your boundary, for example, might say something really negative to you about you. And you can ask yourself, how much of this is true and about me? How much of this is actually about that other person? And what do I need to do in order to regain my personal power and stand up for myself, if I need to do anything? Or can I just walk away and ignore it? So those are your internal boundaries, and those help to support you. But it's also vital in many ways, especially with those more difficult boundaries, to find supports. So this is a difficult process, especially, in my opinion, especially for teachers. There are probably other people that would argue that there are other careers that are more difficult, but honestly, for teachers, setting boundaries is so difficult. And just like any practice, you need to find supports and ways that you can work through it. Sometimes those are your friends. Those can also be your family, your partner, your spouse. There are also support groups built around this kind of thing. There's support groups for specific groups of people. There are teacher support groups online for helping you to set boundaries. There's blogs and podcasts about it too. But there's also literal, like, other support groups, like the ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics. There's support groups around that are specifically built for, hey, girl, you need to set boundaries, do it. And people who are all working on the same thing. And then, of course, counselors and therapists are extremely helpful in this case. I'm the kind of person that believes everybody needs a therapist because we're all working through something. And I fully support in mental health journeys the idea of seeking that outside help. And then, of course, going back to that idea of starting small, be gradual with this process. It's easier to stick to your boundaries if you start with something you know you can implement. If you jump straight to the big thing of maybe saying no to any new projects that your administrator brings to you, that can be real hard. So choosing to start small with something that you know you can implement is vital. And so here's a few quick tools and resources for you. The first one is a boundary booklet that we put together. So just like that mindfulness booklet, we decided to create a boundary setting booklet as well. This has an overview of all of the information from this presentation, as well as several pages for helping you to work through the process and reflect on it on your own. So it's a little tool to help you with the practice of boundary setting. Then we also have in here an inventory assessment. This is built for relationship-based boundaries, so with partners and friends, but it's something that can also help you to solidify your idea around boundaries. And then this article, I believe it's from Edweek, but I could be confusing it. Resilient Educator, 5 Ways to Set Boundaries to Protect Your Peace is a great article to start your practice with. And then very last, before we say goodbye and have a quick minute for questions, I want to invite you to a quick grounding practice. So this will help us to get back into our day. So just like at the beginning, you can have your camera on or off, eyes open with a soft gaze or closed, and take a moment to return to your breath. I know I need to do that after a presentation. So a grounding activity is specifically built for helping to combat anxiety, stress, unwanted memories even. A lot of people use these for different calming methods. For this one, I want you to take some moments to think about someone special or someone that you love a great deal. Focus your attention on that person's face and describe it to yourself in great detail. Think about describing this person's face as though you were talking to an artist who had never seen this person and couldn't get a picture. All of those little details are vital in getting the portrait perfect. Now imagine that person telling you something loving and kind that you need to hear right now. Maybe they're telling you, it's okay to set boundaries, honey. Maybe they're telling you that times like these are tough, but so are you, and you can get through it. Now imagine giving that person the biggest, warmest embrace you can. Pulling them close. And now as you release that embrace, take a big, deep breath in and out. And slowly bring your attention back to the screen. That grounding activity is one that I really adore because sometimes it makes me really emotional in a different way. So if I'm finding myself feeling anxious or angry or upset, this one kind of takes my emotion to a much warmer, more loving place. And I find that to be very helpful. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really fun session, and your interaction in this session has been amazing. So thank you so much for your questions, your participation, and for your presence. If you'd like to contact us, our contact information is on this slide. And there's also a link to the Summit survey and feedback form, which you can access through the bit.ly. If you have any questions, I think we'll be sticking around for a few more moments. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely. You all take care too. Thank you again for joining us.